we're shifting gears a little bit, like I told you we would. But to start with, I want to remember a quote that we had talked about quite a while ago, and then we talked about it once or twice since. Remember this guy? We talked about him, George Walt. Won the Nobel Prize in Science in 1967-ish, I think. And basically, he said that we choose, talking to other scientists that are atheists and evolutionary in their beliefs, we choose, the emphasis is on the word choose, to believe the impossible that spontaneous generation is the cause of life. Even though it has been disproven over 150 years ago by a bunch of guys that said that life has to come from life, life cannot come from non-life. The problem is that if evolution is true and there is no God, that has to break that law, and there has to be life coming from non-life. A couple other people that are quoted along the same lines. Now notice that he says we choose to believe, and the reason we choose to believe that is we refuse to believe in a supernatural creation because of philosophical beliefs. In other words, we don't want to believe in God. This guy kind of says the same thing. I want atheism to be true and am made uneasy by the fact that some of the most intelligent and well-known, well-informed people I know are religious believers. It's a scientist, PhD in philosophy also. It isn't just that I don't believe in God, and naturally I hope that I'm right in my belief. It's that I hope there is no God. I don't want there to be a God. I don't want the universe to be that way. Here's another one that's a little more well-known. Stephen Hawking. Okay, passed away now. Brilliant mind in science. But he was very much an atheist. He says things like, I regard the brain as a computer which will stop working when its components fail. There is no heaven or afterlife for broken computers. That is a fairy tale for people afraid of the dark. You think he believed in God? No. I say I don't believe in God, but I'm afraid he might hear me. And that was tongue-in-cheek, I'm sure, trying to make a joke. I don't fear God, I fear his believers, as if the Christians are the problem. And because there is a law such as gravity, the universe can and will create itself from nothing. Because there's gravity, he deduced that we don't have to have any kind of mind to start the universe. Okay? It seems that there is a kind of underlying theme here as far as why atheistic evolutionists have their point of view. It is not because the science leads them to it, it's because they have a preconceived idea of what they think they want to be true, and they make the science fit. And I hate to say that because these guys are brilliant in so many ways, but it took me a long time to figure out that for sure, I think that's their motive. It took me most of my life to come to the conclusion that that is the motive, and that's why we are spoon-fed this over and over and over again. Interpret the evidence in such a way that excludes any form of higher power beyond ourselves, which is kind of the same thing that Eve did in the garden. Everybody says, I can't believe God kicked them out of the garden because they ate an apple. No, that wasn't the point. They rejected a higher power, even though they could see him and talk with him, and put their faith in themselves. That was the sin. Okay? We talked a little bit about this guy before. We're going to hear him in video twice today. He has a book that we talked about a little bit, and I've actually went over a couple of the things in the book so far. The book is called Icons of Evolution. He has a second one out called More Icons of Evolution or something along that lines. But the guy just recently passed away. We're going to look at a video on two different topics by him, a real short one when he was very young, one when he was very old, but he basically is saying the same thing. And he's the guy that has both a PhD in religion, some kind of religious theology, and a PhD in, what is that, molecular cell biology. And he realized, as he went through the science, bachelor's, master's, got to the PhD level, that evolution had not proved. The scientific community and all their teaching in the college has never proved evolution to be true. They have just understood that that was what they wanted to be true, and they presented it that way, and most people just believed it. And he was one of the few people that said, look, you haven't proved your case. So he started looking into it. And he wrote this thing called Icons of Evolution after he had done all that research. And to remember what an icon is a person or thing used as a reason for why you believe. And in his book, he has 10 of the most noted icons, things that the scientific community that's atheist cling to show that they think evolution is true. And we've already gone through and showed that he has disproved 2 of them. We're going to do 2 more today, 2 more next week. All right? So there are 2 things, as far as I'm concerned, that are necessary. They are mandatory if atheistic evolution is going to be true. The first one is there has to be an observable and demonstrable way in which life came from non-life. We've already said that's one of our big hang-ups. No life, life. No mind, mind. No logic, thought, feelings. Now there's logic, thought, feelings. Where did that come from? Okay? They have to be able to show a mechanism where you went from non-existent life, non-existent thought to thought. All right? I don't think they've done a good job of it. We're going to discuss why. And the second thing is they need to be true is that they've observed changes from one kind of species to another. Now, we've talked about the fossil record, and we basically said in the fossil record that they haven't shown that this species, beyond a shadow of a doubt, came from this species. What they've done is they've shown us 2 of them that have a similar pattern of some way or another, and they're assuming that it has to be that way because they don't want to believe the alternative. Okay? Today we're going to cover 2 more. One of them is known as the Miller-Urey experiment, and the other one is all the experiments over the last 100 years done on fruit flies. We didn't mention that before, but we're going to get into a little more detail. So the first one, Miller-Urey experiment. Miller was a grad student at the time, working on, I think, his PhD, and Urey was his overseeing professor. And together they did an experiment that looked like this. That's actually Miller. Yeah, that's Stanley Miller in 1952. I would have been 1 year old when this happened. And that contraption over there, this is the drawing of what that contraption looked like. Okay? It involved a laboratory flask that contains simulation of the Earth's, what they thought was the Earth's primitive atmosphere at the time, in which electric sparks could be produced and shock the chemicals and make building blocks of a living cell. It has been claimed that this was the discovery that of how a spark of lightning could ignite the soup, the slime, or whatever it is, and cause the first cell to come to life. Others had tried before him, they had failed, but Miller changed a little bit of the chemistry in that tube right there, in that flask. He put in methane, ammonia, hydrogen, and water vapor. And these chemicals were meant to be what he thought the atmosphere on Earth would be before life. Right? And then in the other flask, there was what would be considered at the time, millions of years ago, ocean water, because they knew that there was water. Okay? They didn't really know for sure whether all of these were there, but they put them in there for the experiment. This water was heated, and a spark that would simulate lightning was added to the gases. And the experiment ran for about a week, and then something happened. Various organic molecules, including amino acids, were formed. Now, amino acids are one building block for life. They're one of the things that a life has to have. All right? So they didn't create life, they created amino acids, but they created them out of those chemicals under these scientific conditions. To science, but to the scientific world at the time, this seems to prove that life had a chance to form spontaneously by accident, even though it was contrary to what Pasteur and the others said about spontaneous generation. This was big news at the time. All right, what we're going to look at now is 3 short videos. One is going to be about 4 minutes, and then 1 minute, and then another 4 minutes. The first one is a PBS special, a segment of it, that talks about how this experiment was right and how it proved it. And then the next 2 are going to be about scientists that say that's nonsense. All right? So, here we go. I figure they can say it better than I can. Let's get it up so the audience at home can hear it. So, here we go.
In 1871, Charles Darwin speculated in a letter to a friend that a warm little pond might be life's birthplace. A warm soup of chemicals bathed by energy from the sun would have been, well, comfortable for molecules to come together in new ways and create life.
Darwin was way ahead of his time. A nice little warm soup is going to get you a long way.
Jeff Bada of the Scripps Institution of Oceanography in San Diego has spent his career working to understand the early Earth's soup of chemicals. He began under the direction of perhaps the most famous scientist in origin of life research, Stanley Miller.
There are in the history of science turning points where we suddenly see the history of Earth and life differently. In the early 1950s, Stanley Miller, the eager graduate student, and Harold Urey, the Nobel Prize-winning mentor at the University of Chicago, conducted this astonishing experiment where they made an early Earth environment.
It looks like this sort of a Frankenstein-type apparatus, but actually it's a very carefully thought out design.
Bada sets up a modern-day test of the 1950s experiment on Miller's original lab equipment.
One flask contains water. That's to simulate the ocean. The other flask has just got the gases in it. So this is the atmosphere.
Just as it does in nature, water from the ocean evaporates and rises into the atmosphere, where it condenses and returns to the ocean. Miller simulated what he believed to be the atmosphere of early Earth, with different gases, like ammonia and methane. Then he added the spark of genius.
Miller and Urey decided to use a spark to simulate lightning because that's such a ubiquitous process in the atmosphere of the Earth.
That was the real inspiration, these little electric sparks. They acted like simulated lightning.
The energy from the spark of lightning breaks down the gas and water molecules, so they can undergo further chemical reactions.
To their astonishment, when they turned this apparatus on, after only a couple of days, you started seeing this pink color developing. And then a few more days, black, oily goo is forming around the electrodes.
The electrodes get covered with new substances, organic compounds usually associated with life.
And it wasn't just any organic compound. It was amino acids that make proteins the ingredients for life.
Amino acids are the building blocks of life. They form proteins, which are the key component of muscles and other tissues.
People thought, this is a key step in the origin of life.
And you really believe that you can bring life to the dead? That body is not dead. It has never lived. I created it.
The experiment raised the fear that a Frankenstein creation, like in this classic film, was just around the corner.
People were saying they made Frankenstein in a test tube.
Had Miller and Urey cooked up life in a test tube?
Many of the news headlines were saying life created in the laboratory, life created in a test tube. Well, of course, that was wrong. The real news was that he made these compounds that are part of life.
Okay, so that is a documentary on PBS a few years ago, part one, that, what would that be? Pro-evolution or anti-evolution? Pro-evolution, right? That's how they explain it, okay? So the next two we're gonna watch our scientists are going to explain why that doesn't really show us anything, all right? Doesn't really show us anything. Before you got here, I want to mention this one more time because it's key. These two things we're talking about today come from this book, all right? Just happened to be a book I read quite a while ago. And as far as I'm concerned, there are two things that are mandatory if evolution is going to be true. The first one is what this film was talking about, and that is that there has to be a necessary or a mandatory way that evolutionists can say things like they can demonstrate that life came from non-life. All right? Now, they're not going as far as saying that life was created in the test room, but they're saying that this shows that it could be because we got the first building block. Okay? The second thing, we're going to talk about it here in a few minutes, is that there has to be a way that one species changes into another species. And he has another one in here that talks about that. So what I want to do next is I want to watch, who's the guy doing this one? Don Batten. Now we've seen him twice before. And he's going to talk very quickly. It's only going to be a minute long, so you got to pay attention as to why he says this experiment doesn't work, but they still cling to it. All right, here we go.
The Urey experiment showed that life can form without God.
In 1952, a long time ago, seems like the best they've got still, but what did they do? They had some gases. They had hydrogen, methane, ammonia, and some water vapor. They put some sparks through it. They got a few of the 20 amino acids required for protein formation, and they claimed that this had something to do with the origin of life. But they got left and right-handed amino acids, so you can only have left-handed amino acids if you're going to have functional proteins. Also, it has to have no oxygen present, because if you have any oxygen, you have an explosion or you burn the stuff. So could the Earth's early atmosphere have ever been devoid of oxygen? No, because if you have water vapor, you have cosmic rays zapping the water vapor and making oxygen. So the whole thing's quite artificial, and it's quite deceptive to claim it's got something to do with the origin of life.
How many different things did he say that are contrary to what they know in science? We can watch it again if you want, because I think this one's important. He lists like maybe 4 things altogether.
I lost count.
You want to go back and watch it again, since it's so short?
Doesn't the famous Miller-Urey experiment show that life can form without God?
In 1952, a long time ago, seems like the best they've got still, but what did they do? They had some gases. They had hydrogen, methane, ammonia, and some water vapor. They put some sparks through it. They got a few of the 20 amino acids required for protein formation, and they claimed that this had something to do with the origin of life. But they got left and right-handed amino acids, so you can only have left-handed amino acids if you're going to have functional proteins. Also, it has to have no oxygen present, because if you have any oxygen, you have an explosion or you burn the stuff. So could the Earth's early atmosphere have ever been devoid of oxygen? No, because if you have water vapor, you have cosmic rays zapping the water vapor and making oxygen. So the whole thing's quite artificial, and it's quite deceptive to claim it's got something to do with the origin of life.
Name one.
You need only left-handed amino acids.
Now, he said that before in other videos that we've watched, okay? And he actually demonstrated, I don't know if you were here at that time when we watched that video, it was a while back, how there are two different kinds, but in order to have life spark, you can't have the matching set, you can only have one. And this can't do one, it has to do both, all right? What was another one? He took notes, I like that.
Can't have any oxygen.
Yeah, there can't be any oxygen present, but there was oxygen here, and oxygen would have to be there because that's what the atmosphere does. I mean, there's oxygen in the water, for crying out loud. It's H2O.
And also, if plant life came before human life, plant life can't exist without oxygen.
True. Yes. Yeah, that goes back to like our third, I think, right around our third session here, where we talked about symbiotic relationships. And one of the main one was we breathe out carbon dioxide, plants breathe it in, plants breathe out what we breathe, and it's a symbiotic relationship. You can't have one without the other. Exactly. And they only had a very, very few of the many, many amino acids that you have to have. Right? All right. This next one is by Jonathan Wells himself. All right? This is going to be by Jonathan Wells himself. Now, this is when Jonathan Wells was very old. Like I said before, he's actually passed away now. Yeah.
What was that black guy's name?
Which guy?
The British guy that was talking.
Don Batten. Batten.
Thank you.
Yeah, I like listening to him. He's got a lot of interviews with that young lady on various topics of evolution. He's a PhD in, I remember the science right now, but anyway, this one is 4 minutes. It is Jonathan Wells that wrote the book here, talking about the same topic.
The Miller-Urey experiment. In 1953, Stanley Miller, in the lab with Harold Urey, simulated what scientists then thought was the early Earth's atmosphere. This was an honest experiment. Miller was not out to trick anybody. The atmosphere he used contained methane, ammonia, hydrogen, and water vapor, and he used an electric spark to simulate lightning. So there's the spark. The water would boil here, the gases enter here, spark, and then the results would accumulate down here. And after a week, Miller analyzed this brown tar and found some amino acids, which are the chemical building blocks of proteins. And this was widely touted as a step in explaining the first step in the origin of life. This showed how the building blocks of life formed on the early Earth. That's the way it was advertised. By 1980, however, geochemists had concluded from many kinds of evidence that the Earth's early atmosphere consisted of gases emitted from volcanoes, and that any hydrogen that might have been there, being the lightest element, would have escaped the Earth's gravity into space. So here we have a comparison of the Miller-Urey gases, water vapor, methane, ammonia, and hydrogen. Lots of hydrogen here, including lots of free hydrogen. And the volcanic gases, water vapor, nitrogen, carbon dioxide, carbon monoxide, a lot of oxygen here, and a few other trace gases as well. Well, in 1983, Miller himself, with a colleague, tried using a carbon monoxide, carbon dioxide atmosphere to produce amino acids. And they found that the glycine, which is the simplest amino acid of the 20-some amino acids our bodies contain, glycine is almost the only amino acid produced from carbon monoxide and carbon dioxide atmospheres. And then, only if they added excess hydrogen. Well, remember, that was the first thing to disappear from the Earth, according to geochemists. So they had to add excess hydrogen just to make this work. And if they wanted anything more complex, they had to add methane as well. So by 1999, it was clear that the experiment didn't work. This is Freeman Dyson. Miller's experiment was supposed to be a true simulation of a prebiotic, that is, pre-life chemistry on the primitive Earth. But now nobody believes this anymore, except the biology textbooks, which all used to persuade students that life had a materialistic origin. So it started being used in 2000. Now it's 2017, and it's still there. Here are three widely used textbooks: Kenneth Miller and Joseph Levine, Scott Freen's Biological Science, Mater's Biology. All of them use the Miller-Urey experiment to convince students that scientists have explained the first step in the materialistic origin of life. So the conclusion here is the Miller-Urey experiment, like other icons of evolution, some of which I'll mention in a minute, persists because the science education establishment wants to indoctrinate students in a grand materialistic story of which this is the beginning. The icons serve to illustrate the story, but in every case, they misrepresent the evidence. This is zombie science.
And he mentioned Mater's book, and I have showed you several times of different ones that are in Mater's book still. This is one of the more famous ones. And this is 2 pages on that experiment in that science book at the college level. Okay? It's there. I mean, they got all the gases they think that were there, drawing it as if it was the slime coming from the water. They got his experiment here, and they got the whole explanation of the whole thing. Yep.
If the gases came from volcanoes, that kind of tracks with the fountains of the deeps.
Yeah.
Rising upward.
Yeah, in fact, I was going to mention that, forgot. I'm glad you brought it up. Absolutely. A lot of this stuff tracks really well with how the Bible presents it, even though the Bible's not a scientific book and it doesn't explain it scientifically.
Even the theory of like the order which life evolved is just Genesis.
Yeah. Or how it was covered up.
Yeah.
Both. Absolutely. Good observation. Okay. We are now going to talk about, oh, by the way, when I looked up on AI, and I asked AI on Google, did the Miller-Urey experiment prove evolution? This was its answer. No, it did not. What else are they going to do? Here's what most people don't think of. Let's say all the scientists finally realized that they believed the hoax their whole life, and now they know that it's totally not true. You think they're going to come forward and go, oops?
You would like to think they would.
No, they're not going to do it.
Very few.
Okay, I hate to say it like this, but they're like the little kid that tells one lie, and when he's caught, he tells a bigger lie. Okay? It's the same principle, and that's exactly, as far as I'm concerned, what's going on.
I also like that God is using their own invention against them.
Yes, and this happens over and over. It not only happens in science, we're going to see later in the second big part of this class, it happens in archaeology and geology. Okay? I mean, they say that something doesn't exist, but the Bible does, so the Bible has to be wrong, and then they find it. Happens over and over and over again. It's almost like God trickles this stuff out just in time so that anybody that really wants to know can say, oh, maybe I should change my mind. But the ones that don't become fools, like it says in Romans chapter 1. Okay? And their minds are darkened. All right, the next one are the fruit flies. And we did mention this once before, but we're going to go into a little more detail this time. And what fruit fly experiments, and this, the first fruit fly experiments were done like in 1909 or something like that. Yeah, 1909. So it's been over 100 years that they've been doing fruit fly experiments. There's a reason why. One generation of people is roughly 25 to 30 years, which means in 100 years, how many generations are you going to have of people? 3 to 4. 3 to 4 generations of people in 100 years. Not much evolutionary change is going to take place and be observed in one man's lifetime over a 100-year period of time, especially since evolution has only been around as a theory by Darwin. Now, it was something that was in different forms in other ancient societies, but the modern scientific version has only been around since the mid 1860s. So 150 years plus, a little more than 150 years. But fruit flies, they multiply and die real fast. In fact, there are 25 generations of fruit flies every year. So, in 100 years, they've been doing this experiment for more than 100 years, they've got at least 2,500 generations of fruit flies. That's a lot. That would be like taking humans back to 62,000 BC or more to get that many, okay? So to them, this is idealistic. And they did have the purpose of trying to show that evolution can change with mutations over time, because we can prove it through fruit flies, because fruit flies have a short lifespan, very short lifespan, so we can do so many generations with them, we're going to be able to see the evolutionary change. Now think about the kinds of changes that they would expect to see in 2,500 years, or 2,500 generations. Well, that is just what the evolutionary Darwinists tried to show in the past 100 years with the fruit flies. This is a picture of some of their experiments. Now, they get a lot of test tube ones off the internet, but this is whole colonies of buildings. Inside every one of those is like 100,000 or more, maybe, I don't know how many, fruit flies. And they just keep over and over and over and over again. Isolate them, watch them, take out samples, observe the samples, and analyze them. And they've done this for a long. And their idea was that over time they were going to come up with something that was a different organism, or at least a super duper fruit fly. Okay? In fact, this is what one scientist says. Yes, fruit fly experiments have demonstratively, we've seen it with our own eyes, shown evidence of evolution, particularly rapid adaptations to changing environment conditions. Now, before I go any further, an adaptation is not evolution. All right? That's like, I'm used to the cold now. I didn't used to it. All right? That didn't change me into a polar bear. I learned that when I was in school. I don't even know if they teach that anymore. Okay? Because they don't want to. They changed what the word adaptation means in recent times.
They seem to be doing that a lot.
Oh, yeah. Adaptation to changing environmental conditions within a relatively short time frame, with studies observing changes in physical characteristics and genetic variations across generations to control laboratory settings. That's what that guy happened to say. And I forgot to get his name, but he was an evolutionary scientist. Another publication in The Scientist, which is a magazine, said that the pace of evolution was incredibly surprising, studying the fruit flies. It's super fast. Fruit flies are already known to evolve at a speedy pace. Okay, here's what they got so far in 100 years, 2,500 generations fruit flies. Now notice that they watched them normally, but they also zapped some of them with certain kinds of radiation to try to speed up the process because they thought that might be true in the early Earth. All right, here's some things they got. Fruit flies with different colored eyes. Right? They got some with extra antennas or eyes popping out. Those are the eyes popping out right there. Right? They got a set of extra wings. Now we're going to have one of the videos going to talk about that set of extra wings. One of them is going to say, look, it shows that they could develop another thorax and get extra wings, and that makes them super duper. And then we're going to have a counter to that in just a second that says that's nonsense. And they got some without wings at all. All right? What did Don Benton say about what mutations do? Do you guys remember when we watched that video a while back?
It tears down, doesn't build up.
It destroys things, doesn't build things. All right? Now, they'll say that scientists will tell you otherwise, and there's a reason why they can and still not be like totally lying. And I'm not saying this is a bad thing, but he used the example that the Russians are advancing on Ukraine. So in order to benefit the Ukraine, they blow up bridges so that the Russians can't get their tanks across them. Did that benefit? Was that a benefit? Yeah, but what did they do to gain that benefit? They destroyed the bridges. They didn't build the bridges. They didn't build anything to deter the Russians. They destroyed something. And that's what Dr. Benton, the one that we just listened to on the other video, said before, was that even in mutations can change things, sometimes to the benefit, but in the process, they're destroying stuff, not making new stuff. And he talked about cancer as being one of those possibilities. I think that something like an atomic explosion back in the 1940s or early 50s, they were doing above ground atomic bomb tests out west. And there are a lot of people that ended up with cancer afterwards. Okay? Those were mutations that was caused by blowing up something physically. I mean, no pun intended. But you know what they never did get in 2,500 generations of fruit flies? They never got anything but a fruit fly. They got all kinds of variations. They got things that would be deformities, but they never got another anything but a fruit fly. Now, here's going to be 3 videos again. They're all about 3 minutes long. Oh, I guess Dr. Benton's going to be in the middle one. I didn't remember. The first one is a lesson being taught that the fruit flies show evolution to be true. And then the next 2, like before, one is Benton and one is Jonathan Wells again, only when he was younger, saying that they don't actually show what the evolutionists say. So here's the one that says, evolution is true, and here's why.
So if you're not used to thinking about molecular biology, I like to try to use this analogy as well, which is that some people will say that the genome is a blueprint for living things, and that's true. I think there's a little bit more nuance that we can even pull out of that. The proteins, which are, again, the molecules that are made from our genes, function like tools, right? So we can have a set of tools that can be used to build many different things. You can use a similar set of genes, and if you use them in different ways, use a hammer in this position for one species, if you will, and a saw in that position for another species, you will end up with different forms. Okay. So again, the analogy here is that proteins are the tools. Other parts of the genome that contain sequences known as non-coding sequences that control regulation of when, where, and how to use those tools. That would be sort of the blueprint, and they work together to produce the phenotype, the trait, the house in this case. Okay. All right. So there's a few experiments I'm going to tell you about in the next couple slides here that were really instrumental in helping the research community reach this understanding of how development works and how changes in development and gene regulation can contribute to evolutionary change. So one of the first was an observation that when we had mutations that changed where a gene was expressed, we saw changes in the phenotype. So in this particular example, this is a close-up picture of a fruit fly's head. So you're looking at there. So these are its two eyes. I keep moving this pointer. An eye here, an eye there. These are the antennae. This is the proboscis, or sort of the mouth part. When a particular gene's expression was changed, was in fact turned off in the antennae, what was discovered is that these antennae now, instead of developing as antennae, developed into legs. So this is a mutant fly here that has legs where the antennae should be. Okay. This is a class of gene known as homeotic. The homeotic mutant is a transformation of one part of the body plan into something else. Here's another homeotic mutant. This is what happens when you turn off a gene that is usually on in the sort of middle part of the fly here. It's thorax that includes the part of the thorax, which includes this haltere, this balancing organ. And what happens when you change that is that the fly, the fruit fly, which normally has only 2 wings, develops 4 wings. Okay, and it actually develops a whole second thorax region. Okay, so it's a transformation of one part of the body plan into a different part of the body plan. And interestingly, evolutionary analyses have shown that this haltere, this balancing organ, is in fact a modified version of the hind wing from the ancestors. Okay, right. So dragonflies are 4-winged. As they split, as sort of the evolutionary process unfolded, modifications evolved to that hind wing that gave rise to the haltere. So genetically, a couple switches can actually restore sort of the old development program.
All right, what are the 2 things that are the problem with what she says about this right here? That I think are problematic. Because what they're trying to do is get a super duper fruit fly or something different than a fruit fly. What's the first one show?
You got legs on the station.
It's just a dysfunctional fly.
You do a mutation, it doesn't do something positive, it puts a leg where the eye's supposed to be.
Mm-hmm.
The second one, I don't know if she said it very quietly and very fast. This little haltere, what did she say those were for?
Balance.
Balance.
So that can't even fly?
Those wings don't work, those second wings,
That's
and they can't fly now. You're gonna see that,
They're balance.
and you're gonna see that in a second in a demonstration by one of these other scientists. Okay? So they're not telling you it destroyed the fruit fly. They're telling you, look, we have the next step of evolution. Okay? All right, here we go.
So you've broken something which helps it survive, so it's helpful, but you've broken something, you've not created something.
And that seems an important distinction there. It's still broken something, even though there may be something helpful happening.
Correct.
So, Don, then are you saying that all mutations are harmful?
No, as we've just discussed, there are examples of helpful mutations, but even the helpful mutations are breaking things. So it's a bit like the Russians have invaded Ukraine. So Ukraine has blown up bridges to stop the tanks from advancing. Okay, so it's helpful to blow up the bridges to stop the tanks advancing, but blowing up the bridges doesn't explain how you make the bridges. And so the mutations blow up bridges,
Yes.
which can be helpful,
Yeah.
but they don't create the bridges. That's the problem.
But in effect, yeah, evolution is saying they need to.
Yes, the evolution has to have a mechanism for creating new bridges, not just blowing up the ones that are there.
When we're talking about mutations, often people are thinking about cancer. Is that relevant?
Very much relevant, yes. So cancer is caused by mutation. And my own father died with prostate cancer, so sort of a bit close to home. And many of us have been touched by that. So yeah, mutations are killing us, they're not creating us. And this is a fundamental problem. So when mutations were discovered back in the early 1900s, they got quite excited about that, especially when they discovered that radiation can induce mutations, because mutations were then thought, well, that's a mechanism for evolution to create new features. So they embarked on a program of breeding fruit flies after irradiating them. So they irradiated them with gamma rays and
Right.
induce mutations. This is the little ferment flies you get when you leave some fruit out on the bench and you get the little tiny flies flying. They're Drosophila ferment flies, and they've been used for laboratory experiments for 100 years. And so they irradiated these flies expecting to make superflies. And they did that for many years, and they never got anything other than a defective fly. So they got ones without wings, and ones without legs, and ones with extra antennae, and all sorts of defective flies, but never got superflies.
But they genuinely thought they were going to produce.
Well, they generally thought they were going to sort of supply. They were going to prove evolution basically by breeding these flies with irradiation, mutating them, and making them into demonstrating how evolution progresses.
And what do you think led them to think that the idea of mutations was going to do that?
Well, modern genetics have found that the features of living things are based on our genes. And so you need to find a way of getting new genes to create the new features. So this became well known and became a crisis for evolution. And then they discovered mutations. Oh, this is how they get the new features. And because the mutation is a new feature in the sense of a fruit fly without wings is different,
Yes.
But you don't put wings on fruit flies by mutations, you can just take them off.
All right, one more. This is Jonathan Wells, the writer of that book right there, when he was very young, explaining the same thing.
Modern Darwinian theory, known as neo-Darwinism, is based on the idea that mutations in genes provide the raw material needed for evolution to work.
Darwin's theory requires a source of new variations. And in modern Darwinian theory, that source is genetic mutation. Well, we know genetic mutation can produce changes in proteins, protein molecules. This is what leads to some cases of antibiotic resistance in bacteria. But evolution involves a lot more than changes in protein molecules. It involves changes in entire organisms, shapes of organisms, what biologists call morphology.
One of the best known examples of a mutation affecting morphology is the four-winged fruit fly.
In opening a biology text, one will often see a picture of a four-winged fruit fly. Now, as we know, ordinary fruit flies have only two wings. The four-winged fruit fly has not only its regular set of wings, but a second set of wings just next to that. And the caption or the text will say, this is evidence for the process of evolution, that mutations affect the process of development, and you can get anomalies as interesting as a four-winged fruit fly.
Gene duplications and rearrangements of genes can indeed produce very sudden genetic changes. They can produce changes that are as dramatic as a fruit fly that suddenly has an extra pair of wings or has an antenna where its eye was supposed to be. And I give those as examples not of evolution, but of the ability of the genetic toolkit to produce very sudden and dramatic changes in an organism's morphology.
Well, it turns out that the four-winged fruit fly is actually a very poor example of Darwinian evolution, certainly.
There are no muscles attached to it, so the second set of wings is effectively dead. The fly is a hopeless cripple. It's kind of like having a small plane with an extra pair of wings tied to its tail. The fly can only survive in the laboratory, and it would be selected out by natural selection in the wild. So it's not a step forward in evolution. It's an evolutionary dead end. And it turns out that all morphological mutations that we know of are either have no effect on the organism at all, no fitness effect, or they're harmful. We don't know of any that are useful.
I think this creates a real paradox for evolution. If you're going to change animal form, you've got to do it in a way that the organism can survive and can pass on those new changes. We don't have examples of these kinds of large-scale changes. It's almost as if the fruit fly says, if you want me to exist at all, I better have 2 eyes, 6 legs, 2 wings, and so on. I better have more or less the normal form.
One quote and we're done for the day. This is a scientist, Dr. Brian Thomas. Evolution was not observed in fruit fly genetic manipulations, nor has it been observed in decades-long multi-generational studies of bacteria and fruit flies. The experiments only showed that these creatures have practical limits to the amount of genetic change they can tolerate. When those limits are breached, the creature don't evolve. Instead, they die. Okay? Any questions, comments? Yeah.
Kind of goes to show that playing God has really grotesque and horrific effects.
That is true. That's a good observation.
Because like the fly with the legs on its face, that is maybe uncomfortable.
I mean, there are examples of human beings that are born with variations that are kind of hard to look at. Okay? It's the same idea. It's not evolution. Okay? It's because we're living in a fallen world. Right? People don't want to go back to Genesis chapter 3 and say, this is the reason why we're living in the world that we are living in. It's because of what happened back then, in the 3rd chapter of Genesis. Okay? Sin separated us from God. We're going to talk a lot about that down the road. Good. Anything else? All right, next week we're going to talk about 2 more out of this book. I'll tell you what they are, but at the moment I can't remember. I'm old.
I'm young, I probably wouldn't be able to remember either.